If you're coming to Washington, D.C. during the National Cherry Blossom Festival, I'm going to tell you about what to expect and give you some of my favorite tips. Hello, welcome to Trip Packs DC. My name is Rob. I'm a tour guide here in the nation's capital. If you're coming to Washington, D.C. and you're looking for the best tips, tricks, and hacks for exploring the city, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification icon so that you don't miss any new videos. And if you're interested in taking a Trip Packs DC tour, including a very limited edition Cherry Blossom tour, head on over to trippacksdc.com afterwards to see all of the tours that I offer. If you live in or have been to DC during the Cherry Blossom Festival before, leave a comment on this video with your best tips or advice so that other visitors can learn from your experience. Otherwise, let's get started. First, let's understand the concept of peak blossom. The most important thing you need to know about Washington, D.C.'s cherry blossoms is that they are notoriously difficult to time. The National Cherry Blossom Festival is actually about 1 month long. In 2018, it runs from March 20th to April 15th. Even though the festival runs for about 4 weeks, the blossoms are actually only at their full peak bloom for about 1 week. Peak bloom is defined as the time when approximately 70% of the cherry trees are blooming. So when you see those amazing photos of the tidal basin exploding in red and white flowers, those photos were almost certainly taken on the day of peak bloom. When this actually happens actually depends on a lot of very difficult to predict weather variables, and it can change substantially even from year to year. For example, in 2016 and 17, we had a pretty early bloom, with the peak date being on March 25th. However, in 2014 and 15, we had a much later bloom, with the peak date being on April 10th. So if you're traveling a long distance to get to Washington, D.C. for the Cherry Blossom Festival, it's probably a good idea to dial back your expectations, especially if you're only going to be here for a few days. My advice is to come not expecting to see a full peak bloom, but to be very pleasantly surprised if you do. If you're traveling a shorter distance and you definitely want to see the blossoms during their peak, you can keep an eye on some of the predictions. The National Park Service publishes an official prediction, and the meteorologists from the Capital Weather Gang in the Washington Post publish one as well. And I will leave a link to some of those resources in the video description. The next thing you should know if you're coming to Washington, D.C. during the Cherry Blossom Festival is that you should prepare for extreme crowding. It's hard to describe in words just how crowded the National Mall gets during cherry blossom season. So I will just say that as a tour guide, I have given hundreds of tours on the National Mall, and the only time I've actually lost someone on my tour was during peak blossom. They just got engulfed in a massive crowd of tourists. Seeing the cherry blossoms on the tidal basin is truly a travel bucket list kind of experience. I am extremely spoiled in that I have already done this many times in my life. But just like New Year's Eve in Times Square or any other big tourist event, you have to come expecting that a lot of other people are going to want to do it too. That said, not all hope is lost. Here are my tips for avoiding the biggest crowds. The good news is that Washington, D.C. has cherry trees all over the city. There's a joke that if you ask any longtime Washingtonian their favorite place to see the cherry blossoms, they'll probably say, whichever tree is closest to my house. Point being, there are beautiful cherry blossoms all over the city, not just the world famous ones on the tidal basin. The U.S. National Arboretum is a beautiful place to see cherry blossoms and a lot of other really cool plants. Since the Arboretum is not at all accessible by metro, many tourists consider it way too far off the beaten path to be worth their time. But if you are willing to spend a few bucks on a taxi, you can have a much less crowded cherry blossom experience. My personal favorite thing to do during cherry blossom season is to take my bike and ride a loop around East Potomac Park. It's just to the south of the Jefferson Memorial, but for whatever reason, most tourists don't cross the interstate to get here. If you do want to do this bike ride, I will leave some resources in the video description so that you can get a rental bike to check it out. My last piece of advice is to not skip the official events. I think the signature events are the coolest part of the National Cherry Blossom Festival, and there's 3 that I try to get to every single year. The Kite Festival is my personal favorite. There are professional kite flyers doing tricks, synchronized performances, and kite battles. Then there are just a bunch of regular folks like you or me flying whatever kite they could buy on Amazon on the grounds of the Washington Monument. It is such a cool and unique experience to see the Washington Monument with hundreds of kites flying around it. The next event that I really like is the Cherry Blossom Parade. You do need to buy a ticket if you want a bleacher seat, But my personal favorite thing to do is to show up early and watch the performers practicing on the National Mall. And lastly, the concert and fireworks show is a lot of fun, and one of the few times of the year other than on Independence Day when you can see a professional fireworks display in DC. And that's it! Thank you for watching this video. If you found it helpful, you can subscribe to this channel by clicking on the TripHacks DC logo, which is popping up right now at the bottom of the screen. And if you're coming to DC and want to sign up for a TripHacks DC tour, you can click on the Capitol Dome on the left side of my head. That'll take you over to triphacksdc.com, where you can see the tours that I offer. Enjoy your trip!